Listen, friends, I know you'll absolutely enjoy today's conversation. I'm speaking with Fred Swaniker, a leading global entrepreneur who many of you will already know. Fred is a serial entrepreneur, one that the ultra competitive A type folks among us will absolutely love to hate. And that's because Fred makes it incredibly difficult for anyone to keep up with him. Over the last 2 decades, Fred has been charting a rapid course of innovation throughout the African continent and the world, bringing exciting disruption to the worlds of education, leadership development, and institution creation. Fred's achievements include the founding of the African Leadership Academy, the African Leadership University, a leadership accelerator called ALX, and The Room, which is a community of high impact leaders on a path to create global change. Now, these all fall under the umbrella of the African Leadership Group, which is working to transform Africa by developing 3 million ethical and entrepreneurial leaders by 2035. Now, Fred is globally recognized and has just way too many accolades for us to list here. But just wait. Please tune in. Listen, stick around, and hear what Fred has to say about learning and leadership in today's world. Well, Fred, thank you so much for joining us here at Luminos. We're excited to have you and thankful for your acceptance of our invitation. We're, as you know, talking to international leaders from various countries who have had some role in driving education systems through crisis. And we want to draw lessons from experience of people like you so that we can better understand how to respond in our current coronavirus pandemic. So to begin, Fred, I know that you're somebody that people are generally aware of, and you've done some incredible work over the last couple of decades, but would love to go back and sort of have you begin with us and tell us your story from when you were young. How did you get into education?
Certainly. Thanks for having me, Mabuso. So I'm originally from Ghana. At the age of 4, my family left Ghana due to some political instability. And then we went to Gambia, and then to Botswana, and then to Zimbabwe. So I really consider myself a child of Africa. And then also as a global citizen, because after being educated all across the continent, I went to study in the US for my first degree, and then later on for my MBA. How do I get involved? So all this experience of living and working in different parts of Africa really made me very passionate about the continent. And it also got me to realize that we were blessed with people, right? That was one of the things that was just, so obvious, that we had so many people. And so I was always wondering, how do we unlock the full potential of our people? And ultimately became clear to me that the only answer is through education. My family has been involved in starting education institutions for a couple of generations. So my grandmother was involved in starting a school in Ghana. My mother started a school as well in Botswana. And it actually started when I was 16, and my dad had just passed away. And the parents in the town came and approached my mother, who was a teacher, and saying, we want you to start a school because we've seen that your kids all do well in school. So can you do this for more of us? And she said, well, I can't start a school. I've got 4 kids to look after. My husband has just passed away. I can't quit my job. But they kept pushing her. And so ultimately she relented and agreed to start a small study group, as she called it. She rented a small church building, 5 kids and 2 teachers. But she kept her day job as a teacher. And soon more kids came, and they grew to about 25 students. And then by this time I had finished my A-levels in Zimbabwe, and I had come home and I had a gap year to wait. And so she made me the headmaster of the school during that year. And I was 18 and I ran the school for a year, and under my tenure it grew from 25 kids to 50 kids. And I managed 5 other teachers, and I taught some classes myself. And it was really a remarkable experience for me to see how through education, people would enter at the beginning of the year without knowing much, without being able to speak English, without understanding how to do basic math. And by the end of the year, you would see them doing all these things. And I was just completely blown away by how it could transform human beings, through education. And so that was really my first exposure to educational entrepreneurship and to the impact of education in transforming lives. And so I then went on to start the African Leadership Academy 7 years later. But when I was starting, that was much more complex. You know, we're going to develop an institution that would build the next generation of leaders for Africa, and that would require millions of dollars and recruiting talent from 54 countries in Africa. Much, much more complicated project. But I wouldn't have had the confidence to do it, or to think that I ought to be naive enough to think I could do it if I hadn't done that project in a dusty little town in Botswana when I was 18. So that's really my journey into what I do today.
So it is a jump, right, from the dusty school in Botswana to starting Africa Leadership Academy, and from your mother being invited to turn the focus from just being fantastically good at educating her own children to starting an initiative. There's an entrepreneurial thread, and you mentioned entrepreneurialism, but there's also a sense of commitment to others that seems to have driven you, because when you finished your education, you could have gone into any field, but decided to sort of focus on education. What is it about your sense of commitment to the whole that has driven your creation of education institutions?
That's a good question. One of the things that struck me as I grew up in different parts of Africa, I came from a middle-class family. We're not wealthy by any means, but middle class in Africa doesn't mean middle class in the rest of the world. It means we had a roof over our heads, we had 3 meals a day, and my family could send me to government school, right? That's kind of what it means. And so many people in Africa don't even have those basic things. And I remember as I grew up in these different countries, I would see so many people who didn't have access to basic things. They maybe didn't have a meal for a given day. They didn't have a roof over their heads. They didn't have education. And I kept wondering why I was so privileged to have access to those basic things that are taken for granted in the rest of the world. And so over time, one of the things that has driven my commitment is really the desire to really leverage the relative privilege that I have had. Because after all these opportunities, after this, going through education, I was given a full scholarship to come to college in the US. And then later on, I had a full scholarship funded by my employer to do my MBA at Stanford. And I feel really blessed. I felt really blessed to have all these opportunities. But also wondered, why I was blessed with those opportunities and others were not. And so it's really a philosophy of mine that I developed over time, that those of us who are privileged enough to have access to opportunity, like education, like healthcare, and even those of us who are lucky enough to have lived to this age that we are now and to have access to networks, etc. The only way we can justify that privilege is by using it to serve others, and by using it not to solve simplest problems of society, but the hardest problems. And so that's one of the things that drives me, is really saying, that this is the only way that I can justify the relative privilege that I've had, is to use my networks, my influence, my talents, and my hard work to create opportunity for millions of other people who didn't have access to the same opportunities that I had.
So when you started Africa Leadership Academy, the school, what made you decide to begin at the grade levels that you did? If you think about the entire education value chain, you chose a specific sort of segment as a starting point. Tell us why.
Good question. A couple of reasons why. One is, when we started the project, the original vision was to actually get young people at the age of 12 to come into the institution. Because I thought, if you have them for a longer time, you can mold them more. Because we wanted to create leaders. And so the African Leadership Academy project is not an institution simply to solve the education problem. It's really, we're leveraging education as a means to an end. Our end goal is leadership. We want to develop leaders for Africa. And so we thought, okay, let's get them at the age 12 and take them through a 6-year program, etc. But as we started doing market research with parents, we found that many of the parents were reluctant to send their kids to boarding school at the age of 12 from all across Africa to a brand new school that had no track record. And at that age, many of them were quite interested in separating boys from girls, and they wanted religion to be a very important part of the education. There were a lot of things that they wanted, if they were going to give away their children at that age to come to us. And so we went back to the drawing board and we looked at could we actually get them at a slightly later age where parents would be more comfortable and that they had done their bit to instill in them some of the values that they maybe wanted from the family or religion, etc. So that's one reason that we started a bit later. The second reason is also that it goes back to really our mission to develop leaders. As we thought about it more, we realized that actually people at the age of 16, 17, which is when they enter our institution, that is probably the most formative years of people's lives, because you're just coming out from the wings of your parents and you're starting to form your own views of the world. And at that age, therefore, if we can intervene when you are starting to think independently, then we can really be the foundational, we can really be involved in helping you build your foundational values, and then that can then carry you through the rest of your life. So you're old enough to begin making decisions for yourself, to start questioning the world and not just listen to what your parents are telling you, and to engage in critical dialogue, etc. But you're also young enough that you're not so set in your ways that we can't change you, right? So getting someone much later on, then it's actually too late, right? So it's that nice sweet spot. And it was also an age where we could see true demonstrations of leadership, because now we can start to see people who've done things in their communities and done projects in their schools, and they've started ventures, and they say, okay, you did all this by yourself without anyone helping you? Then imagine what you can do if we actually support you with other driven, passionate people and connect you to networks, etc. Imagine what you can do. So these are all the things that came together for us to say, you know what, actually, we're going to start with that sweet spot from the age of 16. And then, of course, from the African Leadership Academy, we created the African Leadership University. And then now we have ALX. And the scale of what we're doing has gone from an initial goal of developing 6,000 leaders for Africa, which was the goal with ALA, to now 3 million leaders, which is what we're trying to do with the African Leadership Group through our various institutions. But that's kind of where it all started.
So in order to begin with Africa Leadership Academy with a goal of 6,000 leaders, all the way to ALX and the expansive vision that you now have, you have to have started with some thesis on leadership. And I'm sure that's refined and grown over the course of time, but bring us behind the curtain, as it were. What is your conception of leadership?
Thanks. Well, firstly, I'll say that I believe that leaders are agents of positive change. So they are individuals who use the skills, the passions, the networks that they have to drive positive change for society. So if you are able to change the world, but you change it in a negative way, I don't consider that, in our definition, we don't consider you a leader. You might be a tyrant, you might be, something else, but for us to really call you a leader, there must be an element of values in that, and that is really positive. That most people can point at you and say, yes, this person is really making a difference in our lives in a way that we all value. So that's one thing. The other thing I'll say is that you can't just call yourself a leader, right? Others must recognize leadership in you through your actions and through your service to others. what we also believe is that leadership is not something that you can teach, but it's something that can be learned. And the nuance here is really, it's similar to, you can take a horse to the water, but you can't force the horse to drink, right? So there are three things that we think you can do to enhance the likelihood of a leader emerging, but you cannot force someone to be a leader. They need to step into leadership. So there are three things that we bring together, or that underlie our philosophy as we think about developing leaders. The first is you need to identify people who have leadership potential. And that it really involves five things. It means you have courage, because the job of leadership is hard. You have to be willing to change very difficult things, circumstances. You need passion, something that's going to keep you going through all the ups and downs. You need resilience. It's the third thing, because you're going to be knocked down over and over and over, and you have to pick yourself up and recover from disaster, right? Number four is you need imagination, because you've got to be able to imagine a better world and how you can address and come up with new solutions and innovate, etc. And then the final thing is you need a good sense of values, right? Can you tell right from wrong? Right? So we look at those five traits, and then that is the foundation, the potential for leadership. Then the second thing we believe is that you need to give leaders practice, right? So leadership is not a theoretical thing. You learn best by doing. You learn how to be a leader by being a leader, not by learning about it in the classroom. You learn how to be an entrepreneur by being an entrepreneur. So we put our students in all our institutions through very practical experiences where they have to launch projects in the communities. They have to launch businesses at a very early age. They spend time interacting with world leaders. They practice what it means to be a leader, right? Not just sit in the classroom. And then that builds their muscle. Just like I was able to build African Leadership Academy, a much bigger project, because of the small project I did with my mother's school when I was 18. Or Mark Zuckerberg is building a tiny app in his dorm room at Harvard, and then that became Facebook. Or, Nelson Mandela in his early years starting the ANC Youth League, and that then ultimately gave him the practice to do something much bigger later on. So we try and simulate that practice a lot, and that then builds that leadership muscle. And then the third thing you need, the third ingredient, is networks, right? Because no matter how good your skills are as a leader, if you don't have access to the right networks, you won't be able to scale and achieve your full impact. So you need someone who might mentor you, who will open doors for you, who will invest in you, who will introduce you to your first customer, whatever it is. So we bring those three things together into our environment. People with leadership potential, we give them practice, and then we create networks. And then we hope that they rise and then they step into leadership. But again, we cannot guarantee that if we bring you into that environment, you will become a leader. We are seeing a very high fraction of the people going through our system emerging into leaders. But that's really the philosophy behind our model.
So as you're building out a grand vision for changing or inspiring leadership across the continent, it's one thing. Many people have good ideas, but it's another thing to actually drive that idea through to execution and success on an ongoing basis. I tend to think of 4 E's, I like to call them, that sort of capture at least 4 steps. There are many more, but at least 4 steps that I think are important. Well, establish, equip, engage, and evaluate. So establish being, figure out your plan and what you're going to do. Equip is build a team and enable that team to be able to drive the vision. Engage is get to work and do what you need to, and then evaluate, stop and check to see how you're doing. We've covered a little bit about your establishing the vision and the plan, but talk to us about how you build, as a leader, how do you build a team that can grow with you from Africa Leadership Academy to ALX, and sort of take those leaps and bounds in scale to the point where you're actually able to look at an entire continent and say, well, yes, our institution will play a significant role in helping shape leadership in Africa for the foreseeable future. What is it about people, recruitment, development, and sustaining a good team that allows you to take that journey?
Well, as you rightly said, ideas are plenty. Talk is cheap. What is much harder is execution and getting things done. And in Africa, and in fact all around the world, there are a lot of talkers and not enough doers. So for me, none of what we have been able to accomplish would have been possible if I wasn't working with other people, right? So I spend about 50% of my time hiring. It's the most important thing that I do. And I personally get involved. I don't delegate it just to others in the organization, especially those first 100 people. I will personally get involved in selecting them all myself, because they will then bring on the rest. At scale, we're going to have to bring on board about 10,000 people in the next decade to bring our vision to life. And so the first few people that you bring on board seed the culture, and then they then help you attract other great people, etc. So that's one of the things that I really believe in. And of course, then you have to empower these people. And I think one of the challenges many founders have is they want to hold on to the idea. And I really believe that if you want something to get big, you have to give it away. You have to let others own it, and others bring their own energy to it, and others then drive the growth. And then it's not just me. And so I surround myself with great people. That's all I have to do. and it's really as simple as that. And whenever we're not executing, if I look at the root cause of it, it's because I've got the wrong person. And so unfortunately, that means having the courage to remove people from roles if they're not performing, or they don't have the right values, or if if their beliefs are not aligned with yours, right? Or with the mission of what you're trying to do. So you have to make those tough calls as a leader. But being relentless about finding the best people and empowering them, and then holding them accountable to getting stuff done. Another thing that is important in the equation to scale something that I really believe in is institution building. So we're very fond of creating projects, but we're not good at building institutions. And institutions, in my mind, are entities and missions and movements that can live on long beyond the founder. So, there are many things that I learned about building organizations from my mother, from that school that she started, a long time ago. But one thing that I learned not to do is, my mother wasn't successful in building an institution that could live beyond her. So throughout the journey, of course, after I left and went to school, and she took over the school that she built, she was the only person who ran everything, and didn't empower people around her. And it's one of the highest performing schools in Botswana, right, for the last 25 years. She does a phenomenal job. But if my mother's not there, things don't work. And so I said, I don't want that to be me. I need to build something that works even when I'm there. I need to make myself irrelevant if I want this thing to live. And so I'm always on a goal to make myself irrelevant when I start something. And that means, and if you have that mindset from day one, then you start thinking through, how do I actually build this institution so that I can step out? And that then creates something that is really robust and can live and scale, right? So there are 4 aspects to institution building in my mind. One is you need an amazing team around you of leaders that you can empower to take on many of the things that you used to do yourself as a leader. And then that leadership team is then responsible for recruiting and building the next generation of leaders. Then you have a self-perpetuating system of leadership. The second thing you need is governance. A strong board that is empowered and that is taking the long-term view. They're thinking about the mission for the next 5 to 10 to 20 years. And you have to build a strong board. The third aspect is codifying what's on your mind, right? So writing down the blueprint, the values, the systems, the processes, all the things that you as the founder have envisioned needs to be put on paper so that if you're gone, someone can replicate what you're doing, right? And then the final thing is you need a robust financial engine, something that's going to keep this thing going on for a long term that isn't necessarily dependent on donors, right? Because at some point, people will get tired of funding your initiative. So those are the four things that I'm always worrying about. And it takes time to do that. You can't, you don't just have an institution overnight, but over time, over several years, I work on that. And so I was able to build African Leadership Academy, ran it for 10 years, and then I stepped down as a CEO and became the chair. And then now I'm just on the board. And then I moved on to African Leadership University, did the same thing. And then I stepped down as the president. And now there's a new president. And then now I'm focusing on ALX. But I've left behind institutions that can live without me, And sometimes when I go to the African Leadership Academy these days, the security guard doesn't even know who I am. And they say, can I help you? What do you want here? And I smile, because that means that the institution is completely independent of me. I've built something that can live on for 100 years. And that's what I'm trying to do with everything here.
So let's take these ideas of institutional building, leadership, and let's apply them to the broader context. So your four principles. Would you say, Fred, that those four principles are applicable and transferable into different spaces? So let's take the work of an education minister who is trying to figure out how to build an education system that creates results for families and children in the short and medium term, but over the course of the long term has a legacy effect, to your point, that it lives beyond that particular minister of education. Do you think these lessons are transferable, and sort of what challenges might there be in the government context that maybe are different to the private sector?
Yeah, I believe that these four principles are absolutely transferable. In fact, they're even more critical in the public sector, because nations are made or broken by the strength of the institutions. And this has been one of our biggest challenges in Africa. We don't have strong institutions. Because when you have weak institutions, then the effect of leadership is amplified too much. So even though I'm in the business of leadership development, the kinds of leaders that, if I think about the public sector that I'm hoping to create, are not necessarily going to be the political leaders. Because the skills required to win an election are very often not the skills required to govern effectively, right? To win an election, you often have to know how to manipulate people. You need to know how to be popular. You need to know how to tell people what they want to hear. You need to form coalitions with people whose values you don't necessarily align with. Those are the skills that you need to win an election. It doesn't tell you how to govern properly and how to lead a health ministry or an education ministry, how to build a balanced budget, how to build infrastructure. Those are very different skills, right? So the most important leaders in an organization are actually the level below the minister. Right? The minister is more of a political appointee most of the time, right? And so if I'm an education minister and I want to have any legacy, I need to build my team. I need to create the permanent secretary, all of the non-political appointees who will actually be the ones to carry on my legacy, because they have, just like I did in my private company, I built a leadership team around me, right, who can carry on my vision. So the most important thing I can do as a minister, if I want to carry on, if I have a good vision, is build my leadership team, the leaders under me and immediately under them, and so then they can carry on. So if the next election comes and I'm voted out of power, they're still there and they can carry on the good work. And if they're excellent people who have been hired because of their skills, not because they're related to me or any other political reason, but I just hired competent people, then that's going to continue. If I have codified things, I've put down the policies, right, and I've created mechanisms for holding people accountable, etc., that continues, right? Same thing with what I mentioned as having a good governance in place, right? Building structures that keep this vision going on. And then finally, you need to have a robust financial engine. You need to think about how you're going to pay for your education system and allow it to be sustainable, without just having to go and ask, USAID for money every single year. So those principles are absolutely applicable. In fact, I think even more relevant in the public sector. And if political leaders focused more on building institutions and not on trying to win the next election, then we would see much better outcomes in education. And in fact, in every other aspect of the public sector in Africa.
So that begs the question then, what we've been for years calling and defining as an education crisis. Would you argue then that, sure, there's a crisis in education delivery and education outcomes, but underlying that crisis in education is really a leadership crisis? And that's not a dig at any leader specifically, but to your point about building that institution of leaders. Could you speak to that? Is that perhaps a good way of thinking about it?
Absolutely. I mean, because development is a generational project. It's not a quick fix. It takes 50 to 100 years to really develop a society. And so you need to build that fabric of leadership, build those institutions that will carry on that work long after any one person is gone. And so you need selfless leaders who are trying to solve problems, not just trying to enrich themselves and acquire fame and fortune, but really, when you look at Africa especially, almost all our problems can ultimately boil down to leadership, right? Whether it's education, it's healthcare, it's infrastructure, youth unemployment, many of the things that we need to do to solve challenge in Africa, it ultimately boils down to leadership. Now, the good news is that because our institutions are weak in Africa today, a good leader can move much faster in driving things during their tenure. Because you're not going to have, because when you have a strong institution, it makes a leader weak, right? Because then you have suddenly this powerful system that doesn't need you, right? So if you have a strong institution, then you move slower. So the stronger you build the institution, the less you can influence it, because that's the whole point of building an institution. You want it to become independent of you. So what we have is a unique moment and opportunity in Africa where if you are a leader and you are truly committed to fixing things in your country, you can move much faster in Africa than anywhere else. Because in the US, you try to do something, the Senate is there to say no, and then the Congress is there to say, I mean, look at when President Obama tried to introduce healthcare in the US. You had all these checks and balances. If you say you're going to run for office and for 5 terms in the US, you can't do that. There's a strong, institution of the Constitution and the different, parts of government and the police force who will stop you, right? But in Africa, we don't have those institutions. So therefore, you have a unique window of opportunity where leaders today can move much faster and drive real change in education and in all the other challenges that we have in Africa. If that leader wants to do it, it's really that simple. They can get their act together, they can move much faster and make the decisions that are needed, bring in the right people into the sector and leave behind a legacy so that after they're gone, their good work can continue. And that for me is the single most important, it's the root cause of the problems we're finding today in education. Unless we address the leadership challenges, we won't get there. And that filters down from the presidential level to the ministerial level, but also even the leaders of schools are critical. It's, if you want to drive change in a school, you only need one person to change. It's the head of that school. It's so clear when you go and you look at results in most schools, it's so correlated to the leader of that school. And so when you're trying to change a system that might have 50,000 teachers and 3 million students, it might only, that whole system probably only has 1,000 headmasters. That's where you need to focus. Fix those 1,000 headmasters and 3 million students benefit.
Which draws me to something I've heard you say before, that there is significant opportunity in crisis. And so right now, many universities, school systems, whether public or private, are sitting on their hands as they're trying to figure out how to reopen and what to do. Many, like yourselves, are sort of expanding the remote learning opportunity through technology. But I wonder, coming back into the conversation about entrepreneurship and sort of pursuing opportunity and seeing discontinuities in the marketplace as a chance to do something, what would be your advice to education leaders right now that are looking at the challenges associated with getting kids back into school? How would you suggest they use this time?
Certainly, as you mentioned, behind every crisis is an opportunity. And so my greatest wish for all who are involved in education today is that they don't simply go back to the status quo. Most leaders are probably, the easiest thing to do is to just say, well, let me just put my head in the sand and pretend this isn't happening and wait until it's over and I'll just go back to doing what I was doing before, right? That's the easiest pathway for you. But it's the worst thing you could do right now. Because one of the things I really believe is that constraints drives innovation. And right now, COVID is creating a lot of constraints. And so you have to reimagine everything. Start from scratch. How can you redesign your education systems? How do you think about different ways of learning? How do you leverage technology? How do we think about, just many things that we should have been doing, which we haven't had the chance to do. You can use the crisis as an opportunity to drive change. And so every single leader today should be asking, not when is COVID going to end so I can go back to my basic way, to the way I was doing things before, but how do I reimagine everything? Use this time where we're pausing to rewrite the rule book and to build better for the future, not to rebuild the same thing, right? And that really is the opportunity here, because then we can come up with models that are faster, cheaper, more effective, more enjoyable by students, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, if we just take a moment to stop and think, because clearly the system wasn't working before. Right? There are too many people out of school, too many people not getting employment, too many, people not creating their own livelihood, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. There's clearly the system was broken. So why do we want to replicate the broken system? It's time to build a new system. And one of the things that this moment is doing for us is creating that opportunity to rebuild. And every time there's an opportunity to rebuild, you can either go and build a previous model or you can build a new model that's better. And that's what we need to be doing right now.
In the Judeo-Christian tradition, drawn from the Bible, there's stories during the times of the nation of Israel with the 12 tribes. There's mention of the sons of Issachar. Now these are men and women who were defined as being able to understand the times. And you get the sense that these were people who would have their face pointing towards the horizon and watching the sunrise, essentially. So in some ways, they're able to look around the corner and get a sense of what's coming. You, to me, seem like somebody who's spending a lot of your time trying to see around the corner. And as you release different iterations of your initiatives and journeys, you seem to be pointing not just to what you want to do today or tomorrow, but where you see us in 20, 30, 40, 50 years or so. So two-part question here. What is it about you that drives you to try and look around the corner? And then perhaps take us into what you actually see for Africa, for leadership, for education, for institutional building. What's the future look like?
What drives me? I suppose that, why I keep pushing the boundaries and thinking about what we can do better is, I would say a sense of restless excellence. I'm never satisfied with what I have done, and I believe that there's much more to do, because it goes back to what I said. If you're privileged enough to be healthy and educated, etc. You shouldn't. The only way you can justify that privilege is by doing hard things. And so we need to keep pushing the boundaries to and not be satisfied with the status quo. And it also is a sense of I don't believe I'm an expert in anything. I always believe that there's much more that I can learn, and therefore what I'm doing is not perfect. And I need to keep asking what can be better and what can be better and continue to improve it, right? So, I guess that's that whole thing of I'm just never satisfied, and therefore I was always kept asking how can this be done better, and then that will just keep forcing. And I guess I'm also very curious and inquisitive, so I'm always looking at different sectors and seeing the trends in other sectors and then seeing how those trends are going to affect us. So I look at what's happening in the technology world, I look at what's happening in society, I look at what's happening in infrastructure, and then try and connect the dots. And many of my ideas are born from seeing what's going on in different parts of the world and in other sectors, and then that influences what I do. So I guess I would encourage other leaders to never stay in their silo, because very often disruption is going to come from outside of your silo. All those people who are building the movie rental businesses 20 years ago were looking at Blockbuster as the business. And what happened? Netflix came and took them out. Now, the people who are building regular retail stores were just looking at that as the world, and then Amazon came and took them out. So if you are only looking in education, there's something that's going to come and disrupt you and you don't know, right? So I'm always looking outside, and then that helps us see the trends. So what are the trends that I see for Africa and for the world of education more broadly? Maybe I'll share what I think should happen. I'm not sure what will actually happen, right? One of the exciting opportunities that I believe we should lean into as a continent and really as a whole world, but I think we have a chance to leapfrog because we don't have the legacy in Africa. One is to move learning from being something which is about the transmission of information and knowledge driven by the teacher or the professor to one where it is really about the young person themselves learning without the teacher, right? And this is really about saying that, if you look at the way the world was for the last 1,000 years, we lived in a world where information was scarce. It was only in the head of the professor or in the library book. And so if you wanted to learn, that was your source. You had to go to the school physically and learn from the head of the professor or from the library book. Today, we live in a world where information is ubiquitous. It's everywhere. So a child today on their mobile phone has access to more information than someone who was doing a PhD at Oxford 30 years ago. But yet we continue trying to teach that person facts and figures. They can learn much more on the phone, right? So what we really need to do is to empower young people. And I mean, one of my heroes that I look up to in education is a guy called Pekka Pura. He's a teacher in Finland. And he was telling me once that, his philosophy that, and he teaches a class in Finland without teaching. The students learn by themselves. And he was saying that, in his mind, as human beings, we start learning around the age of 6 months. Just think about that. There's no curriculum that teaches you how to walk. There's no curriculum that teaches you language. You learn by yourself. And yet, when you reach 4, 5, and then you go to school, we then now start teaching you. And we take you from being the self-learning individual that is naturally in you, and we start to make you more and more helpless. And by the time you now reach university, you are just completely helpless, and you are waiting. Okay, tell me what to do. And so we need to go back to that human innate ability to learn and leverage the fact that today information is everywhere, which we didn't have. And now we haven't woken up to that fact. And so therefore, put the student at the center of the learning and let them realize that they actually need to continue doing what they were naturally born with, right? Learn by themselves, learn from their peers, learn from doing, and then that way they'll it makes education much cheaper because you don't need to stress about finding excellent teachers. It makes education much more enjoyable because young people love discovering and building things and learning by themselves and learning from their peers. and it makes it much more effective. They come up with real skills and they've learned how to learn. So the other trend that I see is we need to really think about learning as a process that is much more linked to the real world. So there's a lot of research that shows that to effectively develop skill in any area, only 10% of it can be learned in the classroom. 20% comes from developmental relationships with your mentors and peers and coaches. And 70% comes from experience. We learn best by doing. Yet today, most education is only focused on that 10%. So we're only unlocking 10% of human potential, which is a travesty. And so, and again, it makes it much easier because now you don't have to stress about having the perfect classroom experience. Think about how do you get that young person into a community of peers and have them work and learn from each other? How do you leverage people from all around the world who have knowledge and maybe retired people who can get on a Zoom call and give Skype conversation and be part of the learning experience for someone, right? Or in a rural community, you can get the elders to sit down and share their knowledge, and that's how they're learning, right? And then the 70% of learning by doing, get people to do things in the field, have them work on projects, have them do internships, have them, shadow other people and learn from them, right? And have them do experiments, etc. Right? That's how the best way to learn. And again, then that doesn't require you as to have the perfect teachers in that mix, right? So there's a lot of potential. Of course, technology has a huge potential as well to drive down cost and increase scale. In Africa, as we look at it, we now have no excuse to get education in Africa because all the knowledge is free. It's available. It's been democratized. It's all over the internet. So we need to go back to what we're naturally born with and tap into all these trends of the future and create a new way of learning, where the end goal is not to memorize facts and figures, but to create lifelong learning individuals who are self-learning and can keep growing and adapting as the world changes and can solve new problems as they arise. And that's the end goal of education, not to give facts and figures. And until that is understood, we'll be missing our potential in Africa and in fact, the whole world.
Fred, you've been a wonderful, insightful, and provocative guest. We really appreciate you taking the time to talk with us. Before we leave, though, I'd like to take you back to where we began, which is in your childhood, as you were growing up. What books, Fred, inspired you as a young reader?
Wow, that's a tough question. I remember I used to like reading this book by, I think it was the author Enid Blyton or something. It was called The Hardy Boys. There was a series called The Hardy Boys. And what I loved about them was the sense of adventure that they had. They were always going out and solving problems and, solving mysteries and things like that. And I think that I see myself as an adventurer. One of our values in the African Leadership Group is adventure. Especially in ALX, we're going somewhere that we have never been before. And so you need to have that adventurous spirit and be willing to take risks. And one of the things that I say is that I would rather fail at trying to achieve something extraordinary than succeed at something ordinary. And I think that sense of adventure that I got from reading those books is probably something that still drives me today.
Any parting advice, thoughts for listeners and viewers?
Yeah, really addressing Africa's educational challenge requires an unconventional solution. So let's not continue with the status quo, and let's use this opportunity with the COVID crisis to actually reimagine everything. And what we need in Africa is new practice, not best practice. And I think if we really follow that, we will, in a generation, have outstanding outcomes on this continent and really be able to achieve our full potential.